I'm gonna have to go into hardcore hacking mode.
Did Kirito hack Sword Art Online? Is this scene in episode 12 actually techno-wizardry nonsense? Or does it have an entirely reasonable explanation and just take a slightly more in-depth knowledge of computers than what the average person might have to understand fully? Hopefully I can clear some things up here, so allow me to explain. My brothers and sisters, my blood, it's your friendly internet logic swordsman, but you can call me Key. I figured it might be prudent to put together a video going over this topic to act as a concise and educational resource that myself and others can reference when discussing SAO with people who raise this particular issue. Because, to be quite honest, I'm tired of seeing this come up and having to repeat myself with each person. And from what I've seen across numerous interactions, the root of the problem is simply a lack of education when it comes to computers, something that I happen to be quite well versed in. Some quick background information on me for those of you who don't know, so you have an idea of where I'm coming from in explaining this. I have a bachelor's degree in cybersecurity and network engineering, an associate's degree in electronic systems engineering, and as of writing this, 22 years of practical experience with computers starting when I was 4 years old, on both the hardware and software side of things. Most of my education and work is centered on the Windows and Linux families of operating systems, and I own and operate a small IT contracting business where I help people with everything pertaining to home and small business networking, system building, and PC maintenance. I'm also the network administrator for a local machine shop. Part of my job involves penetration testing and ethical hacking, which is just what it sounds like. Checking a system for physical and digital security problems with the permission of the administrators if I'm not in charge of said system, by attempting to gain unauthorized access through any present vulnerabilities, reporting them, and suggesting steps to take so that they can be properly taken care of. Suffice it to say, I know a thing or two about hacking. And to give the short answer to the question of whether or not what Kirito did was hacking, no, he didn't hack the game. End of story. Please stop using that term to describe what he did because it categorically is not correct and conveys the wrong idea about what happened in this scene, which only confuses people and leads them to believe there's a problem that doesn't actually exist with the writing. The long answer takes a bit more explanation than that, surprise, surprise, but I'll keep this relatively brief, and hopefully it'll be of some help in understanding what exactly happened here. So to begin, what exactly is hacking? To put it simply, it's the act of gaining unauthorized access to a computer system by taking advantage of a flaw in that system's security measures. These measures include a wide range of mundane practices that even most basic users are familiar with, like passwords and malware protection, and more specific practices like keeping servers behind locked doors and man traps, blocking USB ports on publicly accessible machines on a network, etc. Physical security does in fact play a role in preventing unauthorized access to a system. One thing to note, however, is that while simply sitting at an unattended and unlocked computer would technically qualify under this definition as a breach of physical security by exploiting human error on the part of the authorized user, unless you shouldn't be there to begin with and had to orchestrate the breach of other physical security measures prior, you didn't have to actually do anything to get there. You just got the result via dumb luck by being in the right place at the right time. If we consider that hacking, then sure, I would rescind my previous statement and say Kirito did in fact hack the game. But the criticism centered around that would be moot because, logically, he didn't do anything special to gain unauthorized access to the system. He was in the right place at the right time to use a console that an admin had already authenticated with. There would be nothing to complain about in terms of this hacking being some kind of unbelievable feat of computer skills, when, as an extension of this thought process, everyone who ever sat at a library computer in school and saw that the person who was there before them forgot to log out is, by definition, a hacker for opening a file on their desktop or using the computer when signed in as them. Doesn't really make a lot of sense to apply it that broadly if we want it to actually mean something significant, does it? So, since the breach of physical security was a fluke, the focus of the critique would then shift to what Kirito does at the admin terminal after gaining access to it, and this is where the conversation actually takes place. It's clear enough by how the term is used that most people aren't referring to a breach of physical security but cybersecurity when they talk about hacking, and that's what I'm talking about as well. What Kirito did is a matter of cybersecurity. Context matters. Hence, my previous statement that no, Kirito did not hack Sword Art Online still stands, and I'm about to get into that in more detail. But okay, we've established what hacking is, and that we aren't talking about physical security. So what exactly are we talking about then? Let's take a look at the scene in question.
Cardinal? No! Kayaba! You're gonna find out things don't always go the way you want them to!
Kirito, where are you?
If I'm fast enough, I might be able to use the GM's account to access the system.
Kirito! Are you okay? What's this?
The system was about to reject Yui's admin credentials. The only thing I could do was take her program and turn it into a game object.
So right there, we've got a nice simple explanation that tells me everything I need to know as someone who's familiar with this stuff. But what if you're not? Basically, after Yui had authenticated with it using her own admin credentials, Kirito used the terminal to locate her program in the file system, duplicate or move it before it could be deleted, and compress it into a different format that the game recognized as an object. There's another important piece of information in the next scene, where Asuna asks what's going to happen to Yui if Aincrad disappears. Take a listen.
If the game does get cleared, and this world ends, what's going to happen to Yui?
Don't worry. I fixed it so her data will be saved to the local memory on my nerve gear. When we get back, recreating her the way she was isn't gonna be easy. But if there's a way, we'll find it.
While the exact wording is a bit odd, what he's saying is that the location he chose for her new directory in the file system is the local storage on his nerve gear, or more specifically, the mount point where the system accesses his nerve gear's internal storage. Which makes sense, given that in the heat of the moment, not only would that naturally be the first place he would think to move the files, but his paternal instinct would want him to keep Yui close. On a technical level, this makes perfect sense, given that in order for the game to read and write data on the nerve gear units, it would need to have access to their internal storage, which means that they would be mounted as external devices to the game's servers over the internet, like a wide area network or WAN version of your own computer mounting a network drive that's located on your local area network or LAN. Again, he used Yui's credentials without having to do anything to obtain them. She effectively gave them to him willingly, all things considered, and then he simply ran commands that she had permission as an administrator to run. Nothing he did exploited a weakness in the system's security measures or an error on Yui's part in order to break in and gain access to protected information. He didn't have to elevate privileges, manipulate any code, bypass any attempts to keep him out, nothing. The system simply assumed that he was MHCP-001 performing operations that MHCP-001's user token was allowed to perform. He did not hack the game. And that's it really is that simple. What he did wasn't even that complicated when it comes to operating a command line interface either, and would have been well within his abilities given that he's a technology enthusiast as previously established, and later expanded on with Midori's explanation of his history as a computer nerd and with his aspirations of being an engineer discussed and demonstrated in Season 2 in Ordinal Scale. The commands to locate a file or directory, copy or move it, compress it, and create a hard or symbolic link are some of the basics when it comes to learning a Linux or Unix CLI, which even novice users can understand quickly and easily. How Kirito would know this stuff is something I do want to go over though, to put it into perspective and demystify the technical side of things a bit more. Obviously, I can't make this video a comprehensive course on everything I know between college and what I've learned on my own time over the years, otherwise we'll be here forever, but this should serve as a solid explanation of what it is we're working with, and why I say it makes complete sense for someone with my level of familiarity. I recognize that it's not as obvious to others who aren't as familiar with this stuff, and there's no shame in that. If there are any questions, leave them in the comments and I'll be more than happy to answer them to the best of my ability. Anyway. From the beginning, we see that Kirito, a young teenager in 2022, is a technology enthusiast when our first introduction to him is when he's in his room listening to an MMO livestream on his triple-monitor PC while reading a magazine article about Kayaba and his work. What are the natural implications of him being a technology enthusiast in a version of 2022 where the nerve gear exists, which is more advanced than any VR technology we're likely to have in 2 years? Well, to start, we saw what happened in the 2010s with the boom of information and ability to share and communicate more effectively that sites like YouTube, Twitch, and social media platforms brought. Of course, Japan has access to all of that as well, so it's not an assumption that these are resources a little Kazuto, who we find out later has had such an affinity for computers since he was a small child, like me, that he built his own PC by 6 years old, would have. And part of those resources, increasingly, is information about Linux and other open source substitutes for the typical Windows scenario. So if by 2014 he was capable of building a PC out of spare parts, had increasing access to vast and digestible resources related to his interests over the next 8 years leading up to 2022, and is clearly very engaged with it, it's only natural that he would be exposed to Linux and Unix systems and learn about them. Not an assumption. Inductive reasoning. And as a side note, I'll make this one appeal to visuals that just serves to further solidify what already makes perfect sense in my mind. His desktop sure doesn't look like Windows. Now for Kayaba and Cardinal. The internet is overwhelmingly run by Linux servers because, simply put, Linux is objectively better than Microsoft's NT system when it comes to security, stability, and expandability. And it's completely free and open source. Anyone can look at the code inside the Linux kernel and develop their own operating system if they have the time and skill to do so. Anyone can develop code for the Linux kernel. As of July 2015, Linux and BSD made up about 98.1% of servers on the internet, and 96.4% of that was Linux. Windows Server was only 1.9%. In other words, from a technological and statistical standpoint, if you've got a high-power, high-security server, it's probably Linux. So then what would Kayaba's custom-built system be, or if Cardinal isn't its own OS, what would it run on? Overwhelming odds that it's Linux. If it's Linux, or a custom OS he built himself that's derived from Linux, why would he change the basic command set that's universal among all Linux and Unix systems? The only mystery becomes what package manager Cardinal uses, not whether commands like grep, ls, make directory, cp, and so on work. The existence of the seed, however, is what tells me that Cardinal is its own OS, and it's directly comparable to the Linux kernel in that it's an open-source, modular operating system that anyone can tweak and compile to create their own distro, or in this case, VR world. Also, the primary reason I gravitate towards Linux rather than Unix or BSD as a base is that Linux simply better suits the application and behavior of the software. The only way Kazuto would have been able to share the package and those companies would have been able to create their VR worlds legally is if it were developed as open source software and was licensed as such, or components of it were closed source to begin with and those proprietary elements later went open source as well or were removed. The seed is stated to be a stripped-down version of Cardinal, after all, and only the version running ALO is full spec, so the differences would most likely lie in proprietary software integrated with the open-source base. Otherwise, the current owners of Argus's technology could have taken legal action over the source code for something they owned being disseminated on the internet and used by competitors. And they'd probably win. Say goodbye to GGO and everything else based on the seed. But I'm not a legal expert, especially not on Japanese law, so I can't really speak to that in any detail. So based on all of this, it's my conclusion that Cardinal is a Linux-based system, and Kazuto would have enough experience with those kinds of systems prior to entering SAO, because he's a huge computer nerd in his mom's own words, that he would be able to navigate the file system and execute basic terminal commands that he already had admin privileges to execute, because Yui was the one who authenticated with the system, and he was just using her access token. I think that about covers it without getting too deep, so to wrap up, I just want to offer some actual criticism of the show when it comes to this scene, for the same reason I'm able to understand it and come to its defense narratively. I know what the hell I'm looking at. The way it's presented visually really bothers me, in that it utilizes the cliche hacking scene imagery when the rest of the show is so good about its visual storytelling and attention to detail. This just comes off as lazy. I get why they did it, most people wouldn't have understood it enough to really care, but I absolutely hate that A1 opted for a blank keypad on a terminal where the display doesn't even appear initially, and when it does, we see generic, meaningless computer code that overlaps in different colors to the point of illegibility, and a progress bar with no context beyond Kirito's doing something with the system to save Yui. Even the Vita game Hollow Fragment had the decency to show us holographic displays with maps and tiling window managers that felt less generic, even if they weren't important. This scene is important. I can't help but be kind of mad about it, because A1, I know for a fact that you're so much better than that. I know it's a relatively small detail considering I'm in the extreme minority of the audience, and most people won't care enough to be bothered by it even if they do recognize how generic it looks, and in the bigger picture it doesn't really hurt anything tangibly. The moment is still impactful, it still makes sense, overall it's fine. but it's still there and worth noting because it does make my job that little bit harder when it comes to giving this series the positive attention it deserves. This is also why I try to focus on getting people to make good criticisms instead of the frankly ignorant and dishonest crap that passes for criticism when it comes to this show. If we stop getting hung up on non-issues and raise the bar for what we consider valid criticism by requiring sound reasoning and empirical evidence, rather than just repeating whatever someone on YouTube thinks is a plot hole or whatever other nonsense, and we just politely talk with each other instead of engaging in arrogant sophistry and needlessly hostile bickering, we can elevate the conversation and address any real problems that might exist so that come the new progressive anime and eventually Unital Ring, we can have a show that's even better than the overall spectacular series we've gotten so far. Anyway, I think that's enough for now, so if you found this video helpful, please do let me know in the comments. It really makes my day to know that my videos have done some good. And feel free to share it whenever this topic comes up. Like I said at the top, it's intended to be a resource for that exact situation to save some time and effort that could be better spent discussing something else, or doing something other than arguing about an already debunked claim. Also, feel free to come talk to me on Twitter and join my Discord server, the Black Lotus Familia, both down in the description. I appreciate your time, and if you're content to just watch, then that's okay too. Just consider leaving a like to help me out if you're so inclined. There's plenty more where this came from. Until then, stay cool.